This is all part of a much larger overarching issue called preemption. And preemption is when a higher level of government steps in and takes powers away from a lower level of government. And this has become just an enormous problem in Florida, particularly over the last 10, 15 years or so. If you ever get sort of frustrated with your local government about why some problem that isn't getting solved that you care about, like traffic or the things that you have candidates on the ballot that tell you they're going to work on them. You vote for them and nothing ever seems to change. Preemption is a big part of why. Your frustration with your city councilor or your county commissioner probably ought to be redirected at your state legislator and your governor, with the way that Tallahassee keeps taking powers away from local governments, and almost always at the behest of some special interest is who it drives. This will be another subject that comes up quite a bit in some of the stories we're going to be doing about these records requests. So let's go straight into this week's show. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So today we're going to be talking about another story to come out of the public records that we requested from the Florida legislature following the end of this year's legislative session earlier this year. These are actually the same batch of records that led to our last show, which was about a Republican mega donor and beef jerky magnate, the CEO of Jack Link's Meat Snacks, who got caught by animal rights activists hosting a mass pigeon shoot at a secluded shooting range he owns in a rural part of the state, and who then got Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and the state legislature to change state law to criminalize what those animal rights groups had done. This week's story is actually sort of similar thematically, although it involves a much different issue. Specifically, it's about an attempt by the largest private landowner in all of Florida to crush a local effort to set new rules designed to slow suburban sprawl and protect rural lands from overdevelopment. Before we get to it, though, just a quick reminder to click the like and subscribe buttons, help spread the word about this show. And if you're interested in what you learn here, please think about signing up for a subscription to our newsletter. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That'll redirect you to our Substack page. Our subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts or any of our content is behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. And to start, let's jump back to the middle of this year's legislative session. This was back in March when Republicans in the Florida Senate rolled out a last-minute rewrite, an amendment to a giant growth management bill. The bill was Senate Bill 1118, Senate Bill 1118. And the sponsor was a guy by the name of Stan McClain, a Republican state senator from Ocala, who, I did not actually realize this until recently, appears to be quite literally a developer industry lobbyist. He earns income from a group called the Marion County Building Industry Association. The Marion County Building Industry Association. Their website says he's the chair of their government affairs committee, the part of the committee that would be working up the lobbying agenda. So developer lobbyist in the legislature, cut out the middleman, I guess. Anyway, Stan McClain whipped up this 50-page rewrite of this growth management bill. He dropped it on a Friday before a Monday meeting, and this thing was just filled with favors for special interests. There was so much in this last-minute amendment. There was an entire section that was written primarily by lobbyists for Lennar, the giant home building company based in Miami. We will actually come back to Senate Bill 1118 in at least 2 or 3 more shows. There was that much in it. But today we're going to focus specifically on parts of the bill that were targeted specifically at the Orlando area. And now there's a bit of backstory here. So last year, voters in Orange County, that's the county that includes the city of Orlando. It's one of the biggest counties in Florida, something like 1.5 million people now. It basically reaches all the way from Walt Disney World in the west to the St. Johns River in the east. Anyway, voters in Orange County last year approved a pair of amendments to the county charter. A county charter is essentially like the local constitution for your local government. And these two charter amendments established what was essentially a rural boundary. These new rules designed to make it harder to throw up housetops on rural lands, basically slow suburban sprawl. So the First Amendment created the rural boundary itself. So basically, it marked off essentially chunks of largely undeveloped land, mostly on the far eastern and far western sides of the county, and set a new requirement that any attempt to do more intense development that is already allowed under just the rural zoning, any attempt to do that would require a supermajority support approval from the county commission, basically raising the bar to get these rezoning changes and stuff approved by the county commission on rural land. Now, there's an obvious loophole with something like this. In Florida, you could always, if you don't like the county's land use rules, if you're a developer, you can always go find some growth happy city to come annex the land for you, and you just go work with the city instead. And so that's where the second charter amendment came in. Without getting too technical, it dealt with voluntary annexations, like when a developer gets a city to annex his property. And it essentially required the county commission to approve any voluntary annexation. So you could not bypass the county commission's rural boundary rules simply by getting, convincing some city to annex your land, because the county commission would also have to approve that annexation. So these two charter amendments were like among the most popular things on the ballot in Orange County. Together, together they both got about 70% of the vote. So these were like overwhelmingly popular, bipartisan. You only get to 70% support when you've got a bunch of support amongst Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and everybody in between. But Senate Bill 1118, this last minute amendment that showed up in March, would have eliminated all of it. This was actually tucked into the bill in 3 different places, but it would have specifically repealed Orange County's charter amendments dealing with the rural boundary and these municipal annexations. And the records we got after session show this language was written by a lobbyist for the largest landowner in Florida, the largest private landowner in Florida. The technical company name in this case is a company called Farmland Reserve. But you would better know it as the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yes, the Mormon Church is the largest landowner in Florida. It owns something like 626,000 acres statewide. That is about 1,000 square miles of Florida owned by the church, and about half of that land is in Central Florida. It's essentially this vast swath of cattle ranch lands east of the city in Orange, Osceola, and Brevard counties, for people who know counties area. I mean, it is not all that much of an explanation to say that the Mormon Church owns basically all the land between the eastern edge of Orlando and the Space Coast. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not all that much of one. And the church has plans to develop a huge chunk of that land. So a couple of years ago, when I was working for Florida Trend Magazine, I took a pretty deep dive into looking at some of the long-term development plans. So, there's been a lot of battles lately in Central Florida about building new toll roads. A lot of that is designed to open up this Mormon Church-owned land to development. And the long-term development plans out there are unlike anything Central Florida has ever seen. We're talking about something like 200, this was again a couple of years ago, so the plans may have been updated somewhat, but back something like 220,000 homes, something like 100 million square feet of commercial and institutional space, like 25,000 hotel rooms. That's basically the same number of hotel rooms that Disney has. And so specifically, this language to preempt the Orange County's rural boundary amendments, emails obtained in records requests show this was written by a lobbyist for Farmland Reserve, or it came from a lobbyist for Farmland Reserve who gave it to Senator Stan McClain's office, who then turned around and added it to Senate Bill 1118 almost verbatim. And that's not all. Other emails that came up in this public records request show that this Farmland Reserve lobbyist was also working very closely with another lobbyist, a lobbyist whose clients included a real estate development company called Tavistock Development. Now, for those of you who are not in Orlando, you may not know the name Tavistock, but this is This is the biggest and one of the most politically influential developers. Clearly, I would say the most influential real estate developer in all of Central Florida, up there with Disney and Universal in terms of just simply the most politically influential companies in Orlando politics. Tavistock it's owned by Joe Lewis, the billionaire investor who I think used to own, I don't think he still does, but he used to own the Tottenham Hotspur English Premier League soccer team. And Tavistock is also business partners with the Mormon Church and Farmland Reserve. In fact, the two companies are working on a massive development that is essentially just the first piece of the Mormon Church's property east of Orlando. Tavistock is the lead developer of a community called Sunbridge that is in the works. Like I said, that's kind of like the first piece of this being developed. And in case there was any doubt, by the way, this email in which both the lobbyist for Farmland Reserve and the lobbyist for representing whose clients include Tavistock, this email made it very clear that they were specifically targeting these Orange County charter amendments. They wanted them gone. They wanted them repealed. This is important language, the Mormon Church, the Farmland Reserve lobbyist said. I should say I reached out to both Farmland Reserve and Tavistock about this. Now, Farmland Reserve didn't respond. Tavistock did, though, and they said their lobbyist, was not actually representing them on this specific issue. This is a lobbyist works for a firm with lots of different clients, and Tavistock insisted that they were not involved specifically in this rural boundary preemption. Now, neither they nor the lobbyist would identify the other supposed client that was being represented here. So, I report, you decide. I guess you can decide sort of whether or not you believe that. But Tavistock says it did not specifically lobby on this issue. Just its lobbyist was doing so on behalf of another client. What's also interesting about this, though, is these same lobbyists. This isn't the first time these very same lobbyists have tried to stop Orange County's rural boundary and Orange County voters from protecting rural land. So this actually came up last year too. So these charter amendments that were approved in Orange County actually began as a campaign led by essentially a coalition of environmental groups and YIMBY activists who looked at it as a way to try and drive smarter, higher density development around urban areas. It began as an effort to get these charter amendments put onto the local ballot via this locally appointed body called the Orange County Charter Review Commission. And I'm sorry to get so into the weeds here, but every few years, Orange County has this appointed body that can place charter amendments directly onto the ballot. The state has a similar thing that shows up, I think it's every 10 years or 20 years. I'm not sure exactly, but the state has, at the state level, we sometimes have a Constitutional Review Commission that can put proposed constitutional amendments directly on the ballot. This is essentially the same thing, but at the local level. And so as the Orange County Charter Review Commission was working on these rural boundary proposals, these very same lobbyists went to the legislature and got them to slip some language into what had otherwise been a benign bill dealing with the state's Department of Commerce. They got them to slip some language into that bill that essentially prohibited a citizen-led charter review commission from putting a rural boundary amendment onto a ballot. So basically shut down this effort. Activists were able to get around it by going straight to the Orange County Commission, and they got the Orange County commissioners to put these rural boundary amendments directly onto the ballot. So they were able to get around it just by working through. This is how popular this stuff is in Orange County, right? That wasn't enough. After that got onto the ballot, Farmland Reserve, the Mormon Church company, tried to get the city of Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer and the city council to annex more than 50,000 acres of their undeveloped ranch lands. This would have nearly doubled the size of the city of Orlando. And it was done to beat this rural boundary preemption, to beat these new rules that would have slowed suburban sprawl. This annexation attempt ultimately collapsed it became an enormous controversy locally. I mean, again, this was land that was closer to the St. Johns River than it was to City Hall. And so it made no sense for a city to be extending itself like this. And the annexation eventually collapsed. And so the good news here is this effort through Senate Bill 1118 also didn't work. In fact, most of the bad stuff in that legislation ultimately failed to pass this session. So that's the good news. The bad news is it may not matter. And that's because of another bill that did pass, Senate Bill 180. This is one that we actually talked about in another recent podcast, but this was a bill that was supposed to be about helping communities recover and rebuild after hurricanes. People have even dubbed it the quote Hurricane Relief Act. This was the focus. This is what everybody talked about as the legislation was moving through the process. But there was a provision that was tucked into that bill, Section 28, that essentially prohibits almost every city and county in Florida from doing any kind of land use regulation, passing any kind of policy that is, quote, more restrictive or burdensome than whatever is existing law for like the next, I believe it's until 2027. It was almost like a 3-year window. But that's not all. It also reaches back and retroactively repeals anything that or invalidates anything approved since August 2024. And this, when you use language like you can't do anything more restrictive or burdensome, that's basically everything. You try and pass a local ordinance protecting wetlands. That's more restrictive than current law. You can't do any kind of environmental protection mechanisms. You can't do anything trying to reorient density in your communities in a way that drives density towards more urban clusters. All of this stuff suddenly gets taken away. Cities and counties simply cannot do this under Senate Bill 180. And developers are now weaponizing Senate Bill 180 to take down local laws that they don't like. So we've seen at least 2 lawsuits have been filed so far. One is in Manatee County. It was brought by a group called the Freedom Housing Alliance, which is essentially, from near as I can tell, is a front group for the Suncoast Home Builders Association, or the Suncoast Building Industry Association. I forget the exact name, but essentially the local development lobby in Manatee, Sarasota County area. They have filed a lawsuit trying to use Senate Bill 180 to invalidate an impact fee increase that Manatee County commissioners had approved. Impact fees are fees that get charged on developers of new housing that are designed to help pay for all the infrastructure that new housing requires, from sewer lines to roads to schools, that sort of thing. But also in Orange County was just sued under Senate Bill 180 trying to undo the rural boundary charter amendments. This lawsuit was actually brought by a different developer. The lead plaintiff in that case is the technical name of the company is Lake Pickett North, but it's the developer behind this like really controversial project in a rural area called Sustany, I think is how you say it. So Sustany is leading this lawsuit trying to use Senate Bill 180 to undo the rural boundary amendments that were approved by, again, 70% of Orange County voters. For what it's worth, I actually asked both Tavistock and Farmland Reserve if they were supporting that lawsuit in any way, maybe behind the scenes giving support or advice or whatever. Neither would answer that question. We've also seen the DeSantis administration is starting to weaponize Senate Bill 180 and a similar law that had been passed following in a previous session that kind of seemed benign until the DeSantis administration suddenly tried to stop Manatee County from bringing back some protections for wetlands that developers who have been very big donors to Ron DeSantis didn't like. So the DeSantis administration trying to block protections for wetlands in Manatee County using what is essentially the same language as Senate Bill 180. As I mentioned before, I think this is about to become, if it's not already, one of the biggest stories in Florida politics. There are a number of cities and counties that are starting to talk about trying to file some sort of lawsuit challenging Senate Bill 180 under the grounds of, I guess I don't 100% understand what the grounds would be, but I believe some of it would be like the law is so vague, like what exactly is more burdensome or restrictive, and if it is taken literally, that it means literally anything that's even like 1% more restrictive, then potentially you're violating home rule provisions in the Florida Constitution. So I think we could see a big legal battle coming here. I suspect you're going to see more developers also trying to weaponize this. This isn't just going to be an Orange County, Manatee County thing. In fact, as I was looking through stories about this, Volusia County, the county that includes Daytona Beach, they're starting to have like real problems with this. This is going to be one of the things that the Florida legislature is going to have to deal with. And you keep hearing that lawmakers say this wasn't how it was supposed to be used. It would sure be nice to hear the Republican legislators who sponsored Senate Bill 180 start saying that publicly and start getting it out there that they didn't mean to undo basically every piece of environmental policy or smart growth policy that every local government in Florida has adopted since August 2024. If that wasn't in the intent, it'd sure be nice to start saying that publicly so people could start pointing that out to judges in these cases. And I think I want to end this show with one other point, and that the story we talked about today, the rural boundary stuff that the Mormon Church, the Farmland Reserve, was trying to undo, this larger stuff that's coming out of Senate Bill 180. This is all part of a much larger overarching issue called preemption. And preemption is when a higher level of government steps in and takes powers away from a lower level of government. And this has become just an enormous problem in Florida, particularly over the last 10, 15 years or so, where the Florida legislature, the governor and the Florida legislature, Tallahassee, keeps taking powers away from cities and counties to solve, everything from plastics pollution to transportation issues to what kind of symbols they can display, or what kind of events they can sponsor, that sort of thing. This is just, they have ripped away powers. They've even taken away their power to regulate alarm system contractors. We've had records that show ADT, the giant alarm system contractor, lobbying to stop cities and counties from being able to effectively regulate home alarm installations in any sort of way. This is, if you ever get sort of frustrated with your local government about why some problem that isn't getting solved that you care about, like traffic or the things that you have candidates on the ballot that tell you they're going to work on them, you vote for them and nothing ever seems to change. Preemption is a big part of why. Your frustration with your city councilor or your county commissioner probably ought to be redirected at your state legislator and your governor, with the way that Tallahassee keeps taking powers away from local governments, and almost always at the behest of some special interest is who it drives. This will be another subject that comes up quite a bit in some of the stories we're going to be doing about these records requests. And so, I would encourage you. I did a podcast not too terribly long ago, an interview podcast where I had a sort of a national expert on preemption come in to talk a bit about the history of this and how it's starting to be weaponized, not just in Florida, but all across the state, in places where you have state legislatures trying to essentially neuter their local governments and stop the government that is closest to the people from actually doing anything. It's such an important subject, but it's got that kind of wonky name, preemption. So I think a lot of people don't quite realize just how sort of insidious this is. So I would really encourage you, if this is a subject you care about, if you've got any frustrations with how your local government is managing things in Florida, check out that podcast so you start to get a sense of why things may actually be the way they are, and who is really sort of the villain behind the curtain on a lot of this stuff. So, okay, I think we will leave it there. We will obviously be back again. We've still got plenty of stories coming out of these post-session records. We'll have more of those. We're going to have plenty of updates on the way Senate Bill 180 plays out too. Just a quick reminder, click like and subscribe. And if you can, think about signing up for the newsletter subscription at seekingrentsfl.com. And we'll talk again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.